Okay, now to the topic at hand, which is the fact that I introduced some things unknown to anyone else, apparently, with my 3-volume set of books. One of the things I did, which most people were delighted in, was I introduced the Duat and the Absu as 7 rings around the Earth's equator, that is above the equator, on the basis that all planets with magnetic fields have rings. So why would not the Earth have had rings also? And the Egyptians, as a matter of fact, had mentioned 7 hallways rather than rings. I don't know why they called them hallways. And Cardona had assumed that they surrounded Saturn above the North Pole of the Earth. It took 10 minutes of reading through the spells of the Book of the Dead to convince me that it wasn't in the north, it was in the south. Instead of, it's a very strong tradition of the south, as a matter of fact, looking like a sea, and probably looking somewhat like Saturn's rings in the 1980s when it was electrically more active than in the 2000s. And a sea would be suggested by the fact that the rings moved at different speeds with respect to the Earth. Some of them even moved backwards. And as a matter of fact, God asks Job in their dialogue, who keeps the sea within its strand? And then I find out from other sources that the strand that was there identified as actually a last thin yellow ring around the outside of all the rings. I thought that was interesting. Okay. So with that, an enormous amount of strange things in mythology are instantly explained. If you say the sea is the rings in the south, people go, oh, of course, that's what they're talking about. And in fact, this whole concept of a sea in the south stayed with us for probably 1,000 years, so that long after it disappeared, they were still talking about it. The other thing that I managed to locate in time and location was the world flood. It happened in 3147 BC, which most mythologists equate to 3114 BC, but let them do what they want. That's just a mistake in Mayan retro chronology. The Bible, however, locates this at 800 years later in 2349 BC, but that's not when it happened. It happened long ago, and it happened as a series of worldwide tsunamis. And the cause was the removal of Saturn from above the Earth's North Pole, or our removal from below Saturn. The seas of the Earth had run off the North Polar region because the crust was pulled up, and had run into the mid-oceans and the South Polar region where the crust was pulled into the Earth, all due to, and they had stood there for 7,700 years. And then it was released, and probably waves miles high from the South Pole, ran north, and also the whole volume, the South Atlantic, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean all started to move north. The sea level at that time at mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere probably stood hundreds of feet lower, and in fact in the regions in France you'll see complete rings of stones set below sea level, as you will also see by the way in Japan and some other 40-degree north latitude locations. No other flood at any time later on, and there were others, approached the devastation of this, and all retellings of floods or so-called floods always referred back to this event. it consisted not only of the waves traveling toward the North Pole or toward the North regions of the whole length of the globe, but also, of course, the re-leveling of the seas in intermediate areas. The first release of water from the South Polar region, the South Pacific, the South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean would have swept north as far as the Arctic Ocean in only 2 locations where that can be done. And the rest of the places, they just entered the land and coursed across it. In India and Australia, for instance, India and Australia were inundated by northbound waves from Antarctica and the Indian Ocean, to the point where not a single tree or jungle animal was left alive in India. They were all piled up as broken trees and broken bones at Silawak Hills, which is a deposit just south of the Himalayas, on the foothills of the Himalayas. 7 layers of it mixed with mud in between. India was not only wiped clean of animals, but people also. There's no Neolithic or older Stone Age record in India. Nothing was left. And from the south, the tsunamis would have crossed the southern Asia and Siberia, China and Siberia, as it did also in North America. And with the first waves probably ripping out trees and sweeping, especially in Siberia, herds of grazing animals ahead of it into the polar sea, where you have piles up of bones and broken trees, miles, hundreds of feet high, all ivory from antiquity came from the Arctic, from a couple of islands there. And of course, there's many instances of displaced marine species. You have whales in the Andes and in the Sahara, which certainly were not ocean, and in the state of Michigan. The fossil content of Alaskan rivers has been an astounding enigma to archaeologists because of the content of broken bones and splintered wood, much of it from temperate and tropical areas. Where the waves lowered, they just crossed the land so that you end up in southeast United States, for instance, with an admixture of land animals, sea organisms, more land animals, more sea organisms on top of it. And unfossilized closed seashells as part of that mix, which shows that it was not the bottom of a sea then. But in the meantime, I have a third item. I identified the flood of Noah as part of a much more extensive series of events in 2349 BC. The Bible calls this the world flood, or the flood of Noah. Or as Claudia wanted me to write, the Noachian flood. But the event of 2349, we'll just call it the event, was the most terrifying incident that has happened in all of history that was even slightly remembered. It was an alignment with Venus at a distance of, our planets don't hit each other like snow cones. It was an alignment with Venus at 20 million miles that caused a shock in the northern hemisphere, which tilted the Earth's axis away from the sun. Imagine you're the sun. And as a result, tilted the Absu and the Duat up the equatorial rings. And this was followed maybe 6 hours later with a massive disconnected plasmoid lightning bolt. Even plasmoid lightning bolts are not going to move planets or destroy them or split them in half, despite what other people say. They're just going to incinerate things. And it's probably the fact that the equatorial rings were tilted up, the plasma coming from the direction of the sun, that kept us from getting incinerated. But it was a truly massive Coulomb force shock that lowered half of Asia, Central Asia, and shoved the Himalayas over onto existing mountains, which only today archaeologists are admitting, yes, the Himalayas are not 200,000 years old. They're less than 2,000 plus, less than 12,000 years old. And they're sitting on older mountains. And those older mountains do have evidence of humans and their lithic industries. And then, of course, with this by the way becomes the dragon in China, because the plasmoid is a twisted body with balls on both ends, as if they're heads, and then 3 tentacles on both ends, which are seen in Mesoamerica. They're generally held as mouths wide open, and in China they're held as legs. And the dragon is just absolutely classical in China and wherever else it is depicted. But it's the plasmoid. It's the plasmoid hitting the equatorial rings, and as a result, changing the electrical properties so everything turns blood red. And of course, the humans freak out. Not only have all their cities west of the Himalayas toppled, if they were bricks, they just like fell over. But suddenly it looked like everyone was being murdered and their blood was in the sea. This is not the sky, don't forget. This is the sea, filled with blood. And then you saw the dragon, or the badass or the bad goddess that caused all this, and you can track her across 3 continents if you wish. It's Kali in India, who dances with severed heads and has hands as a scapular. That's not the right word in English.
Necklace?
Yeah, necklace, but what is it when it's decorative? And then if you move further west, it's Tiamat and Anat in what the hell is that called? See, this is where I need Julian to sit here and say, it's called Canaan. Oh yeah, Canaan. And Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, and Hathor, seat of Horus, in Egypt. And then even in Europe, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years later, she shows up in a tale as Grendel, which, if you take a look at Beowulf, you'll see it's got 3 sections, and they to be called the 3 instances of huge impacts from a foreign planet, and all the characters are always the same, exactly as they appear to be in actuality. Anyway, with the Earth tilting over and the rings moved up, the opening that was there, because this happened at the equinox, always happens at the equinox, it closed down, so again the rings showed this cave structure above the Earth. And as the Earth's tilt was regained, this opened up again. So the rings opened up, and Jupiter suddenly was seen with a huge mantle, as a matter of fact, moving 8 million miles south of Jupiter, and horns on top, rising out of this grave, and this became, 2.5 days later, this became the resurrection of God, which was, of course, taken up by all sorts of religions and whatnot as their major festivity. And above Jupiter was the Pleiades, which then become a symbol of the resurrection. So, as far as people were concerned, the ancient prime god of antiquity, Zeus or Jupiter or whatever name he goes by, had again saved humanity from further destruction by coming in there and bashing the dragon, the bad goddess or whatnot. And you can find this reflected in legends all the way from India across to North Africa. And then similar information from Central America, from Mesoamerica. And then in China also, it's not only a dragon, but the 9 followers that came after, smaller plasmoid. After the release of a large plasmoid, the voltage drops on the parent planet that released it. So the next plasmoid, if one, is going to be smaller because it's at a lower voltage. And then the voltage drops again and rises again. So you have, after the big plasmoid, a series of smaller plasmoids that come. And these are recollected in China. 9 suns rose, and 8 of them or 10, I don't know, were shot down by some magician shooter. And in Mesoamerica, the same number of suns, or actually they call them catfish, were seen in the ecliptic because of the shape of catfish. Anyway, apparently nobody among the mythologists has been aware of this. Even Velikovsky totally missed it. Whereas it took me maybe a day to connect all these various events across 3 continents together, and then I sent it to Case, and he said, "Oh, cool." But it's been and remained one of my mainstays, and the longer I look at it, the more I realize that how absolutely stupendous this was. All the Maya ever did was reconstruct that opened set of rings, right, and then play ball in between and behead people who won or lost. It's not sure what's happening there. And all of this, of course, was accompanied by changes in the electrical nature of the rings, so that not only did they turn red, which is probably oxygen, or there's a couple of other low-level gases that it's not ice at any rate. It's like don't let them fool you. It's particles. Not only did they change in their electrical nature, but then they started to arc back and forth between the rings and the upper ionosphere and the Van Allen belts, and between that and Earth, and that must have caused endless months of storms and rains, so that everyone was convinced that the sea not only collapsed because it had disappeared at the end of it, but it had collapsed to Earth. That was the second flood. The Mayan actually understand that as a second flood. Eastern Mediterranean just calls this the first flood, the major world flood. And of course the flood of Noah, as far as they were concerned. But, okay, can you imagine people being wiped out everywhere, just washed off the earth? Except in Egypt and middle Mesopotamia, the access to the seas was narrow enough that they probably didn't get waved off into eternity. But just about anywhere else, people just disappeared. It probably accounted for 99% of the population of us. And of course, we're such breeders, we just came right back. But in lesser sizes and magnitudes. Okay, I have one more. It's the event of, again I'm calling it an event, 685 BC. The fact being that between 806 and 687, and this is both Velikovsky and de Grazia expound on this, Earth kept getting closed in by Mars. I'm not sure whether I'm saying the right sequence, because Mars was actually going slower than Earth. So it might be that Mars was there and the Earth caught up to where Mars was. But at some point they were both occupying the same distance from the sun, which means they were going the same speed. If they were going the same speed, then any arcing from Mars would have like circled the Earth. That is, the Earth would have kept spinning. And since Mars was approaching at 1.85, 1.58, I don't know, whatever. I could look it up. But degrees to the Earth's orbit, that means that Mars came by Earth and lowered as Earth rotated, which means that this circle of arcing, went throughout the whole world, everywhere, at enormous speeds, because at the equator, the arc is definitely moving faster than the speed of light. No, faster than, sorry. Oh, not it. Faster than the speed of sound, and even at 40 degrees latitude, north and south of there, it's going very close to it. So, and from Mesoamerican sources, descriptions and diagrams of Mars and its snake that it stands on, it looks like the arc maybe traveled 7,000 miles or so from Mars to Earth. And where it hit, of course, it went sideways, so that the actual path that it burned might have been 600 miles wide. And then moving, can you imagine in Greece, Mesopotamia, Italy, this thing comes out of nowhere, moves over you with 500 miles an hour, doesn't give you much chance to get out of the way. The complete population of Greece and Mesopotamia near the oceans was obliterated. And the goat herders from the mountains came in and became the next population and said, we can build boats and then we can get stuff from other people. And these became the Iliads, raiders, and the people of the sea, although the people of the sea might have been stuff out in the upper atmosphere. So, anyway, the reason Mars managed to produce such a enormous arc, which was to the Earth, is because it was coming from nearly the start of the asteroid belt and moved to beyond the Earth's orbit and then went back again over about a year and a half, basically the same orbit as today. The orbital time does not change with a change in the orbit. The average is the average. And with it, in every instance, came Mercury. Mercury, which had an atmosphere at that time, and as a result had huge plumes on its north and south side, so as it came by the Earth, it would have wings, and it looked like it was flying. And this is where you get the flying disc motif in Assyria and Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Anyway, where the arc struck, things ended up, because it's basically a hurricane moving at 500 miles an hour, which no hurricane today does, and carrying with it sand, soil, burnt trees, ashes, and whatnot, and then dumping it whenever it came to a citadel, because people were still building cities and palaces high up on hills, thinking about the flood of a couple of thousand years earlier. It might return, so we should be up high. Very good thinking. Very bad, because an arc that gets to a high place, which is closer to it than the region beyond it, stops. And if it stops, it dumps all of its shit to, is that an allowed word? It dumps all of its stuff on and as you may recall from reading De Grazia, some of those places were buried under like 10, 15 feet of burnt soil and sand, you know, and there isn't an earthquake or an exploding volcano that will ever produce, or a forest fire ever produce more than a couple of inches of any of that stuff. So anyway, so it, as I mentioned earlier in your presentation, some 98% of the people died. They didn't die just from electric shocks from a 3,000 degree flaming sand that moved sideways from where that thing struck, but also from gases produced. Okay, a lot of them were probably just gassed rather than electrocuted. So, but that was minor. Although the example became the way of life for the Assyrians, right, who decided, yes, speed, and with speed they took all of Canaan, Elam. They, although not well admitted by the Egyptians, but they took all of Egypt down to the first cataract, okay, and imposed their will. So the Egyptians, who have been very mild with their own people, all of a sudden became these fanatics, although it was Assyrian fanatics. So you took something that wasn't yours, you lost your hand. That had never been done in Egypt before. At most, you'd get a beating with a stick if you were bad citizen. They also buried people upside down in Egypt, in Canaan. Oh well, I won't talk anymore about that. The thing that changed us, however, and brought humanity up to our expectations of what they should be like, was an event that happened in 685 BC, which is actually minus 685 in that chronology, and 680 BC in the screwed up European chronology, which the archaeologists know about but have never corrected because it's too much trouble. So anyway, what happened is that Venus and Mercury suddenly started to blaze in the day sky. But of course, the night sky, because it would turn around, but reappear in the day for 40 days. And I thought initially it was a plasma output by Venus, but I realized very soon that it had to be the sun. So the sun all of a sudden went into high activity. 686 BC. I'll just talk through this. We have what's known as the Tower of Babel event, which ushered placed in 2100 BC or something like that, or 24. After 2347, after the flood of Noah. But when the Europeans came to the Americas, the Indians here knew about it. And at first the European missionaries thought, oh, Christ has been here. Or, oh, no, St. Thomas, oh, no. Somebody has been here and converted them all to Christianity, and they've lost it in the meantime. But they knew about the Tower of Babel in all detail. The fact that it got hit by, or actually a column formed all the way up to the planet. And the planet caught fire and burned. And the bottom of the column, because the Earth rotates, kept burning the prairies all the way across to California. And then as the Earth started to move its shape, move its position back into almost all of the Pacific, so that it got recorded in among the natives of, I don't know, Australia or Far East or whatnot, and probably beyond that, because some hours later the Assyrian army outside of Jerusalem goes up in smoke. Everyone dies. 800,000 people or 80,000 people, do you remember? And the king gives up on his siege of of Jerusalem, the Assyrian king, and goes home and spends his days in the temple of Negro, begging his forgiveness. Anecdote where two of his sons put a sword through him and then they take off, but the third son follows them and kills them. This is wonderful people, aren't they? They're still doing the same thing today. Okay, uncut. So anyway, Mercury burned when it fell into a Coulomb shock with the Earth, which I can place centrally at Alabama, at Huntsville, Alabama. You'll see the ring of the depression ring, and then you'll see mountains, of course, as you have at every one of those toward the southwest side, where they got pushed over. And the shock must have moved Mercury to within the orbit of Venus, whereas it never had before. And with that, of course, the whole circuitry of the positive ions, the protons leaving the sun, is completely disrupted, and the sun goes bonkers and puts out this massive CME, coronal mass ejection, that lasts for 40 days. And all the planets, as a result, start poofing out with arcs reaching out into out into space. All the craters on Mercury were created in a 40-day period in 685. Before that, there was very, very little. Although there's one gigantic dent, which must have been the dent with the Earth at that time. So I won't even tell you about the moon burning up, or growing a beard every year, and then going to sit in the middle.
Moving.
So anyway, Mercury ended up without an atmosphere, although it's got a remnant atmosphere that's way out of what it should have been if Mercury had been a blank rock orbiting the sun at 0.3 astronomical units. It should have had nothing on it, but instead it's got thousands of holes, craters, and probably a goodly portion, but certainly not even the majority on Mars, which is the next one out, were created at that time. Venus, basically, because it has an atmosphere and it retained it, basically only some large craters showed. But the Earth burned also, and historians from Roman times complain about the fact that like Arabia is on fire, and the mass ejection from the sun takes a while before it gets out there. In about the appropriate time, all of a sudden, Jupiter lights up, develops a coma, develops probably a mountain again and horns, which it hadn't done for a long time, and then gathers its energies together and sends a plasmoid inward. And the Mesoamerican records show it traveling for 12 days before it reached its target. It was 15 million miles long. It was 5 million miles in diameter. You know how that compares with the Earth? The Earth's 8,000, not million, 8,000 miles. So the Earth's like this. It was seen in the daytime sky. It was seen arriving near the area, near the region of Earth, although 30 million miles displaced from it, by Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, and they all build these things with balls on the end and tines, right? Which are, in Mesoamerica, they saw it full size, and people start carrying basically signs of office, or as the cliche Maya call it, the bundle of flame, because they wrapped it in a deer skin and carried it everywhere and never unwrapped it, they said. In 1500 they said, we never unwrapped it. So anyway, this thing continues on to its, and on July 25th, it hits the sun. It takes 9 hours to land, because it's a big piece of, it takes 9 hours to land. The Maya celebrate New Year's the next day. Teotihuacan in central Mexico, north of the lake, also celebrates New Year's on that day. And then the sun, of course, ends up occluded in this ball of cloud of plasma, and nothing is seen for 5 days. And our records, both in Mexico and in, that is Mesoamerica, and in Egypt, about the 5 days when nothing was seen, except some more catfish coming down because the same thing happened. But can you imagine the sun lighted up day and night for 5 days, and you couldn't see any of the planets nearby? And nearby, where to the west was Mars, and directly west of the sun was Mercury, which had just overpassed the sun, and to the east was Venus, all of which can be found from a graphic ephemeris, which of course my compatriots do not have, or never were aware of. I don't know, whatever. So that apparently ended the expulsion of plasma from Venus and Mercury, Mercury was never seen again, except right above the horizon, before sunrise or after sunset. And then Mars never interfered with the Earth again. Or you could presume that shock that hit Mercury and moved it 50 million miles over, moved some part of the Earth's orbit so that we were no longer in the particular shape that we were before coming close to Mars. Or perhaps it hit Mars, I really don't know, and I've never tracked that down. But we get no more planetary interference. And all of a sudden, everywhere people go, oh, what happened? And take a totally new attitude to explaining everything in terms of the planet instead of physical form. So we see the start of religion, philosophy, mathematics, etc. Although mathematics was there already, and a lot of other things. Simultaneously in North Africa, in coastal Canaan, in Egypt, that's North Africa, in Babylonia, and in India, and in China, before these people ever have any contact with each other. So that was rather amazing. But some other things happened also at the same time. Probably the electric force of the plasma going by the Earth during this 40-day massive expulsion from the sun interfered with the magnetic field of the Earth and moved it. Over a 40-day period, you could move the tilt of the Earth and not get a reaction. If you did it suddenly, you would get a reaction that would bring it back to where it was. So it was a slow 40-day, slow change, and what it basically did was it moved the rotational axis of the Earth from Ursa Major, where we were in the very center, in the pan of Ursa Major, to one of the stars in Ursa Minor, which is like considerable 6 degrees over. A star known among the Arabs as the North Pole, but it's not our Polaris. It's another star in the whole chain. So suddenly where we were, and when you do that, you change the equatorial and ecliptic axis or intersection, so that spring now all of a sudden jump 15 days forward, and fall and midsummer. So that's about it.